There are things we just don't talk about.
So it's a good morning for us, people of Israel, and it's a good evening for you, Leanne Pooley in Auckland, New Zealand. So welcome on behalf of Solidarity Tel Aviv Human Rights Film Festival. It's a great pleasure, honor having you here with us.
Thank you. I'm pleased that the film is screening there.
Yes, we are too. And let me start off by kicking the elephant in the room. Can you go out, shoot film these days? How's the pandemic treating you?
Well, I have to say, New Zealand, we don't have community transmission here. So our life is almost normal. Aside from the fact that the borders are closed, we're pretty much getting on with things as if, you know, it's very odd for us because we know this terrible thing is going on in the rest of the world, and we're in this little kind of island of peacefulness in the middle of the Pacific. But I mean, we're still taking precautions, and we had sort of scanning devices that we use when we go in and out of places. But on the whole, life is almost normal here, except for the fact that we can't travel, which for a documentary filmmaker is a bit of a problem. But aside from that, it's springtime, and so far, touch wood, we've kind of got the virus under control in New Zealand.
So in fact, you're imprisoned in paradise.
I mean, literally,
literally, yeah.
It's true, yeah. So we don't like to complain. That's the only big problem we have is a lot of New Zealanders trying to get back into the country, and we have a quarantine system that's run by the government where you have to spend 2 weeks in quarantine on your way into the country, and that there's only so many spaces, and so there's a huge queue of New Zealanders because we travel so much that there's a lot of Kiwis trying to get. There's something like 50,000. Yeah.
I guess our listeners are keen to hear about how Jazz is doing.
Jazz, she's good. She's incredibly busy. She, you know, since we finished the film, she's published 2 books. Thankfully, she has quite a lot more support now. She's got a lot of sort of a team around her that helps her manage the pressure. You know, when we were filming, she was kind of sort of on her own, trying to deal with sort of the hopes of everyone who contacted her. Now she has quite a lot more support. She was meant to be traveling to a whole bunch of places, working alongside a couple of big NGOs to do with mental health, but because of the pandemic, she hasn't been able to travel, which is why she's managed to get 2 books out in the last year.
How did you get to make this film? What was the first lead?
So what happened was Jazz, you know, there's a scene in the film where she's pitching her web series to an industry festival pitch session, and there was a producer there that picked up her web series and was going to make her web series the story of her friend. Oh,
sorry.
That's right. So they picked up her web series, and she was about to start working on the web series. And the producer that was producing the web series asked me to meet with her and maybe sort of mentor her a little bit, because I've been around a while. I've made a few films, and this was Jazz's first sort of long form program that she'd ever made. So they asked me if I'd come on board and help her. And after the very, very first meeting, I just thought, actually, I don't really want to help with the web series. I'd like to make a film about the making of the web series and the journey I thought that Jazz would go on. Well, I knew that Jazz would go on in telling the story. So I sort of ducked out of being a mentor and started being an observer.
So there are many layers of reflexivity in this film. So there's Jazz, the suffering person, struggling, heroically battling person. And then there's Jazz, the film student or the young filmmaker. And then there's the series she's attempting to make. And then there's you making a film on her. And then there's the fact that she's presenting her series to the participants. And it seems like an ongoing web of interconnectivities. Did you see that beforehand? Was it planned?
I mean, some of it was planned for sure. I mean, it was really in the sense that I always knew it was sort of a film within a film. And that was one of the things that interested me, because I was interested in the conversation that I knew would have to go on around what you could say in a film about suicide and what you couldn't say. And I was interested in that conversation, and I knew that she would have to have that conversation in the making of her web series. So she'd be having the conversation that I was having about making my film separate to my film. And so it is this kind of maze of, you know, Russian dolls. I think it changed a little bit while we were making it, because I became more and more interested in her activism and the cost of her activism, the actual cost to her of what she was doing, and the fact that she was on a journey to come to terms with her own guilt, really. I think, you know, her motivation for making the web series was to do with feeling guilty about the death of her friend, and she had to go on a personal journey to try and come to terms with that. So it became slightly more about that than it did about the making of the web series, if you like. But I have to be honest, I mean, there's a scene in the film where Jazz is showing the web series to the family of girl that died, and I was filming them watching that. And then I had to show them my film later when I finished my film, and they watched it in that same room. So there was a moment later where I was showing them my film, and in the film they were watching the web series, so they were watching themselves watching something. I mean, it was a bit of a head explosion, but I did always know it was sort of a layered thing, and we decided very, very early on to just put all that on the table, not to pretend I wasn't there, to accept that I was there, to pull down the fourth wall and acknowledge my presence, and that my presence had an impact on what was happening, and not to pretend that wasn't happening. So it's a slightly unusual genre, you know, messing with genres a little bit. But
well, for me, it seemed very natural and echoed Jean Rouche's Chronique d'Ante, and it was very fundamental in the sense that there's a deep ethical conversation in this film concerning matters of life and death and people, and it seemed to me that you were struggling with all your mighty to allow us viewers to acknowledge the fact that such a conversation cannot do outside the borders of people's full consent to the fact that they're being filmed.
Exactly. And particularly, you know, as a filmmaker, there's the kind of, you know, first do no harm, you know, a bit like a doctor, you know, you don't want to make a film on an issue that does harm. So we were very conscious, as she was also conscious in the making of the web series, that we were navigating territory that is complex, and that you could do harm if you got it wrong. And I think we were all conscious of that all the time.
So there's another elephant in the room. Is a horrible elephant here, in the sense that on the one hand, you have to speak about such painful matters, such horrible things like people taking their lives on such a scale. And then there's always the troubling, like the pinching question, how can we know that we're doing something right by really raising consciousness to those, like Jazz is one of the most beautiful protagonists I've seen in years. You fall in love with her. And then, you know, by consequence, you cannot even avoid yourself falling in love in the idea of, you know, seducing yourself into the thought of the wonderfully romantic image of taking your life. I mean, she's flirting with it. And I'm saying this in deliberately in a twisted way, just to ask you if you were conscious of the danger that is part of our life as documentarians, dealing with risky subjects. How do we know, or what measures can we take not to do harm in place that I'm sure we want to do good?
Well, I mean, I think the fact that you sort of fall in love with Jazz, I think reinforces the notion that you're glad she's here. And so her decision ultimately not to die, which was a decision finally she made after many attempts at her own life, I think that the audience goes away going, thank God that was the end result of her journey. And also, you know, the conversation about whether we should talk about suicide is one that's been going on for a long time. And for a significant period of time, we weren't allowed to talk about suicide. In New Zealand, in the press, it was illegal to use the term. You know, no one ever said anything. And that hasn't helped. Our suicide rate is very high and it continues to go up. And so not talking about it doesn't seem to be working. And Jazz feels really strongly as someone who's been in that dark place. I mean, I've never been in that very dark place. She has. And she says that saying the word suicide doesn't make her want to kill herself. That's not why she wants to die. Talking about suicide. Now, she does accept, or she does believe that that there are things that are triggering, and we worked really hard to, you know, we never talk about how, so the story has, you know, for the viewers, I guess they've already seen the film, but, you know, there's Jazz's story, which is the story of the girl who's still here, thankfully. There's also Jessica's story, Jazz's friend, and she's the girl who's not here anymore. And the pain of that, and the pain of her family. And so we worked very, very hard not to glamorize what that is. We did talk a lot about, you know, how much we could ask of the audience, but we wanted to show the pain of Jess's not being here without making that seem glamorous, or you know, turning her into a hero for what she did. That was, you know, we're very conscious of that, but it isn't working. And I know that Jazz feels strongly that it isn't working not talking about the subject. It hasn't helped. Our suicide statistics in New Zealand, you know, you know, it's paradise in lots of ways, but we've got the highest youth suicide rate amongst boys in the world. And, you know, we need to do something. And Jazz feels that passionately.
And here's another anomaly here. We are the richest civilization ever to have lived on this planet. And yet, in so many countries, suicide is a severe problem. I guess that after dealing with the subject for so long, you must have some thoughts of what the hell is going on? What's wrong that so many among us cannot handle life? Or is it just because we are aware of it and it's always been like this?
No, I do think it's worse. I mean, I do think the numbers are worse.
Do you have a take on it?
I don't like to speculate, because I'm not I'm a filmmaker, not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a suicide expert. I'm guided by the people I've worked with. I do, in my heart, believe, having raised, you know, children, I'm concerned by the influence of social media and and the pressure of social media to be on all the while, and that you can't escape from social media. I do think with young people that's an issue, but I don't like to speculate too much on the whys and the hows and the wherefores, because I'm not an expert. I'm just somebody who spent 2 years following somebody who is an expert. And I know that she, you know, I think she believes there's that people become isolated, and that not talking about mental illness not just suicide, but mental illness in general and the stigma around it. You know, silence, if you're silent about something, it implies it's that you should feel bad about it. You know, if you're silent about something, if you don't speak about something. I mean, Jazz says in the film, you know, people say to each other, oh, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. And no one ever actually listens or says what they think, and that we're not connecting properly. And I know she feels there's a problem with connectivity, and maybe social media accentuates that because we're connecting in a very removed way. But I definitely think it's worse. Certainly it seems so to me. I know the numbers in New Zealand are worse than they were sort of when I was a young person. What the solution is, if we knew.
Certainly you pointed at conversation as a necessary means to deal with that. It's hard. There was one point in the film where she said, I'm the girl that used to be there. I can't remember the exact expression.
I was the girl on the bridge, she says. Yeah.
Right. Can you share with us a little bit about what induced or enabled her transition from being there to being here with us with such positive energies? What was it that happened really? If I'm not wrong, she never really speaks about it in the film.
Well, she talks a little bit about it in early in the film when she's giving one of her talks. She had tried, I mean, Jazz had as you find out in the film, and she'd been sexually abused as a child, and she had we didn't go into too much detail about her childhood, but it was pretty dysfunctional, very dysfunctional. And she was basically almost on her own from the age of about 15. She lived in the streets for a little while, and she was really suffering and felt that the world would be better off without her. She did try to take her own life on a number of occasions. She ended up a woman who had been sort of, she met a woman through the church she went to, and that woman was very supportive and had herself gone through some really difficult times. And I think Jazz must have just been ready for someone to say to her, you need to fight back. You need, you know, you're not fighting what's happening to you. You're just sort of going along, you know. And Jazz said, you know, there was a moment where she realized that she was just surviving. She wasn't actually fighting. And it's really that simple. She had a conversation. This is how she describes it. She had a conversation with this woman who's still very much in her life and is an amazing human. Didn't want to be in the film. It was interesting. So one of the reasons we couldn't dive too deeply into that beyond Jazz just telling the story was because the woman who's Jazz's mentor didn't want to be in the film because she wanted to make sure there was something in Jazz's life that wasn't in the film. And she felt Jazz might need to turn to her during the making of the film, and she wanted to be separate from it. So, and we understood that. And you know, the film, we had all sorts of things. It's the first, I've made quite a few documentaries over the years, like quite a few. And I've never had one where there was a budget line for therapy. The New Zealand Film Commission actually insisted that we had money put into the budget for therapy. It was in Jazz's contract when we took this on that she would see her therapist on a regular basis. And there was money in the budget for the rest of us, should we feel we needed to seek some help separate to the making of the film, because it was hard on everybody. You know, there were moments in the making that were pretty grueling. And I think that's an indication that we are kind of opening our minds. Like in New Zealand, going to therapy in New Zealand, you know, it's not like the States where everyone has a shrink. It just doesn't happen here. People kind of just muck on, you know. There's a very kind of staunch, do you know what that word means? Staunch. There's a very kind of, you know, everyone's just meant to not complain. Don't make a fuss. The last thing you want to do in New Zealand is make a fuss. And so there's always been a bit of a pushback about reaching out for help. And so it was really amazing to me when the Film Commission, who is the principal financier for the film, said, look, we think you should have some money in the budget in case people need help. And that to me says things are improving a bit.
I want to ask you about your decision-making with respect to your visual presence in the film. If I'm not wrong, you're shown once. I know that for sure.
Twice. Yeah.
Twice.
Yeah.
But it's obvious in the light of the very intensive presence of other people around Jazz that you made the decision not to be present visually. Can you share with us your process of thought?
I mean, part of it was because I was just behind the camera most of the time. I mean, you see me at the very beginning. I come in and do a clapperboard at the beginning, and then you see me
and then toward the end.
at the very end, sort of a bookend. And to be fair, I wasn't in it at all at the first couple cuts, and we did a test screening. And people said, you know, they could hear my voice, and they said they wanted to see me at the front, so they knew whose voice that was. So in my original cut, I wasn't in it at all. And I've never, ever been in any of my films. This is the first time I've ever been in a film of my own. But because we pulled down the fourth wall, because my presence is, you know, the fact that we were making a film, Jazz does refer to me a few times. She actually talks to me while we're making the film. We just decided that we would let people see me a little bit at the front, and then I'd bookend it at the end. But I didn't want to be too present, because I didn't want to take away from Jazz, really. It's, you know, I wanted her to be the focus of the film. I didn't want it to be about me.
It seemed to me in the end, when your image is there for a couple of seconds, like a Hitchcock signature.
Yeah,
the director is here.
And I've been here all along, was what I was trying to say, you know. We've been here. This has been a journey.
Well, there are two key words, I think, that kind of string through the film. That is care and hope. And I want to nibble a little bit on that. Let's start with care. Care is there's an ethics of care. And caring is like an innate virtue, etc. What did this film, the process of its making, taught you about how we should negotiate the principle or the capacity or the virtue of care in our lives?
Ooh. Well, I think I learned a couple things specifically. One of them was, you know, we have a habit of expecting everybody to see the world through our eyes. And I learned that sometimes you can't ask somebody who's in a very dark place to see the world through your eyes. You have to try to see what they're seeing, or at least help them to shift the darkness that might be in their view. But you can't ask them to see, you know, we have a habit of saying to people, one of the most telling things I thought Jazz said in the whole film was, she said she hated it when people said to her, it's going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine. Stop worrying. It's going to be fine. Because you say that, and I know I've said it to my children when they've been upset or whatever, and you say, but what you're doing in that moment is you're negating what it is they're really feeling. It isn't okay. They want to die.
How about consolation? You know, like, it's going to be okay. We need to console one another.
No, because consoling tells them that what they're feeling. Well, this is how I understand Jazz's explanation of this. She says, in saying that, you're kind of undermining their experience, that they're in a place, and by saying it's going to be okay, you're not acknowledging the place they're in. So what I've learned to do when I care for people in that way is to say, look, I know that that you feel like this can never be better. I see that you're suffering, you know, so acknowledge the place they're in, rather than, because by saying, you know, it's going to be okay, we're kind of dismissing the reality that is their reality, you know. We're not, because we can't see the world through their eyes. And that was a real lesson for me, that acknowledging the anxiety or the pain is important, and then take the step to try and find a way to make it better. But don't just kind of sweep it away by saying, oh, look, it's all going to be fine. Because in that moment, if someone wants to die, it doesn't feel like it's all going to be fine. And by saying that, you're dismissing their experience, because it's not the experience you're having. That was a big lesson for me, a really big lesson, and a really good lesson as a mother. You know.
But if I read that despair of people wanting to not live, that is a manifestation of a complete loss of hope, isn't it? Like, there's no hope. My agony, my pain, my despair is so total. I don't see a future. That is the moment where humans really give up on hope. Would that be a fair definition?
We have to acknowledge that that's where they're at. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's what I learned is I have to acknowledge that that is what they're feeling. They're feeling hopeless. They're feeling, well, and the other key thing that I learned is they often feel that their hopelessness and their pain is a burden to you. I lost my brother to suicide while I was making this film. So I had this horrific clash of my private life and my artistic life. And I now know that he probably thought he was a burden. He had a lot of problems, drug and alcohol, blah, blah, blah. And I've learned that people, you know, at first I sort of judged him, you know, I was angry and felt that it was a selfish decision that he took. You know, he had children and it was but I now, working on the film, I realized that in that moment he was wrong, but in that moment he felt he was a burden to the rest of us, that his darkness was a burden. And so that's something to try and understand as well. And that is something we can do when we care for people, is ensure that they don't feel that they're a burden. Because Jazz said that most of the people she talks to feel that if they take their own lives, they'll be doing us, the rest of us, a favor rather than hurting us.
So in so many ways that cannot even be talked over, this film is more personal to you than one can even imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, it was terribly personal in the end. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's strange. It was a strange situation. Yeah. But it was, you know, there was a minute where I thought maybe it was the wrong film for me to be making in the middle of this sort of personal disaster. But it actually turned out that it was the right place for me to be, and that the people I was with were people who had helpful things to say about what my experience was. And Jazz was, you know, all of 22 and you know, giving me advice on things that she could see that I was beating myself up over, because like everybody who's endured a suicide, there's all the things you want to undo, you know, all those things you want to change. And actually there's the woman in the film, the editor, says, you know, Jazz, in making the web series, you know, there's this thing where you want to make the ending different. You want to change the way it ends. And that's how we all feel. Anyone who's endured that kind of loss is that you want to be able to undo whatever it is you said, or change the last thing you did, and we can't make time go backwards. And the lovely editor in the film said that, you know, she said, we can only go forward. And that's the pain of it, and having to come to terms with that. Yeah. But having all the people around me was really helpful in the end.
But in many senses, that ability to look forward and say, we can be responsible to what we will say the next minute, tomorrow, the day after, is that sense of hope, which your film is so saturated with.
Well, that was really important to us. I mean, of anything, the hope is making sure the film was, because Jazz is hope. I mean, she is extraordinary. She embodies hope. If you could bottle Jazz, you could sell it and label it hope. And you know, she spreads that around in a way that I really felt so strongly we needed to try to capture. And even the journey she goes on. I mean, she really did go on a journey herself. And the first time she watched the film, you know, there's a moment in the film where she says she realizes she couldn't have saved her friend. And for her, that's not how she felt when we first started filming. When we first started filming, she definitely felt she'd made mistakes and that it was her fault her friend had died. By the end, she understood that that wasn't the case. So she went on that journey, which kind of is the same journey all of us who've lost somebody go on. And so we can go on it with her, and that helps us. Somebody came up to me at the premiere and actually said to me that her husband had died, 12 years ago, and that she felt at the end of the film it was the first time she realized it wasn't her fault. Yeah, so that kind of hope. And it's interesting when you talk to people, a lot of people say to me, oh, I haven't had the courage to watch my friends, you know, some of my friends say, oh, I haven't watched your film yet, you know, I haven't had the courage. And I say, look, it is confronting, but it is ultimately a hopeful film. And the message is one that is hopeful, not depressing. Like, it's a sad film in some ways because there's a girl who's not here anymore, but it's a very, very positive film because the young woman who is here is so extraordinary, you know, and we're so lucky to have her. Mm.
And how has the process of making this film changed you?
You know, it's really hard for me to say because of the whole drama around my brother. So there was everything all at once. So it's if it had just been a normal film, how it had changed me, I definitely believe that at the beginning of it, I was, like lots of people, a bit judgmental about suicide. I think I saw suicide as a cowardly option, as a selfish option. Because I've never felt that kind of anguish. I absolutely think that the judgmental part of me is gone. You know, I'm not judging anyone about anything anymore. And, you know, we try to show in the film all that hideous stuff that goes online. And Jazz has had a bit of that even subsequent to the film. You know, she's had some pretty nasty things said to her on TikTok and you know, those platforms, from people who are saying, oh, you're just attention seeking, all the usual kind of tropes that come both on social media and always associated to suicide, which we show in the film when there's a scene where those people sent her all those terrible comments. And I would never have done that, but I do know that I was judgmental, and I've certainly learned a lot of lessons around that. And it changed, yeah. You know, you change every day anyway, don't you? You change in your life because shit happens, basically. So, and it's ongoing. It's ongoing, I think, you know, my own grief. Because I actually found that I buried myself in the film, kind of. And so when the film finished, I actually had a bit of a tricky time because I'd made this movie and it's dedicated to my brother. There's an honorarium. And when I saw the honorarium for the first time in the cinema, I thought I would feel good, and I didn't feel good, you know, because he's still not here, and the film doesn't change the fact that he's not here. So it's all, you know, art, life crashes. Yeah. Yes. But I really feel, you know, I'm really proud. I'm proud of the film, and it's certainly, I've made over 20 documentaries in my career, and it's without question the most personal and the one that if I never make another film, I'll say, well, you know, I made that one. So that feels pretty good.
So that just doubles our sense of pleasure and honor of sharing with you not only the film but this conversation. And I truly hope that its message will come across, because I know that many people in Israel and worldwide are struggling with this problem, and I hope that your wish for raising consciousness, just like this festival is attempting to raise consciousness to subject that daily society wishes to suppress,
it was also really important to us that, and I think we achieved it without it feeling like a lecture, but we tried to include all through the film little like nuggets of practical things that people can know, you know, practical things to learn. Jazz talks a lot about making lists for herself, just real specific things. You can do this. This is what you can do. And that was really important too, so that people go to the film and they can take away. So it's not just about watching and having it wash over you, that it's also, there's some practical information that doesn't feel like a lecture, but you're left with that information, so that you, as you say, you know, if you're dealing with somebody who is struggling, you have a little bit of an arsenal to deal with in terms of how to manage that situation better than maybe you would have before. And that was really important to us as well.
So I'd like to conclude by saying that surveying all the options, I think that I couldn't agree with you more than the notion of the importance of conversation. We have to put on the table these subjects that we so easily dismiss and are better off on daily basis not to to put in our view. And I want to thank you for being on the table. And I hope your film will tour the world, or at least the virtual world, the crazy virtual world in which we are. And
I could, if I could ask, if I could ask that people, yes, because we've released it in a very unusual way. We didn't want to just throw it onto iTunes or whatever and then have people watch it. So we've released it on our own website, so that when people watch it, they're on the website, and there's all sorts of other support material. I don't know if you've seen the website, but there's lots of sort of material that can maybe help people if they've got further questions or whatever. So, well, I think that was the right thing to do. It does make it harder to find an audience because people have to find the film. So I am hoping that if people do like the film, they will share the website, which is www.thegirlonthebridgefilm.com, thegirlonthebridgefilm.com, because it's if it doesn't find an audience, then it's kind of all a bit of a silly exercise. Yeah.
Well, we promise to do our share in supporting your film and your cause. And it's been a great pleasure speaking to you. And I wish you and Jazz all the best. And thank you for your generosity.
Toda.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Leanne.
Bye.